The steady beep of the heart monitor was my constant companion, a rhythm I trusted more than any human promise. At 2:47 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday, that rhythm was interrupted not by a failing graft or a sudden arrhythmia, but by the sharp chime of my phone vibrating in the pocket of my scrubs. I should have silenced it. 23 years of being the grateful adopted daughter had trained me to never let anything interfere with my duty. But something in the timing made my stomach twist, as though the universe itself had chosen this moment to remind me that some wounds can't be stitched closed. For 5 years, I had stood in this operating room as a cardiac surgeon, rebuilding broken hearts, restoring futures for families who clutched hope with trembling hands. It was the only place I felt untouchable, beyond the reach of the complicated debt I carried to the man who once lifted me from an orphanage and called me his own. That man was Bob Chen, retired police captain, my rescuer, my father. And the message he had just sent would become the scalpel that cut deepest not through flesh but through everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. The notification sound on my phone cut through the steady beep of the heart monitor at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, just as I was explaining to the Ramirez family why their father's triple bypass had taken longer than expected. 23 years of being the grateful adopted daughter had taught me to silence interruptions quickly, but something about this timing felt ominous, like the universe was preparing to test everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. In my 5 years as a cardiac surgeon at UC San Diego Medical Center, I had learned to trust my instincts about these things, and the message from Bob Chen, the retired police captain who had given an 8-year-old orphan a second chance at life, would prove to be the most expensive assumption of his life. Maya, sweetheart, I need to tell you something about your inheritance from Grandma Pat. Sophia's wedding costs have gotten out of hand, and your mother and I have decided to use the money Pat left specifically for you. Sophia deserves her perfect day, and you've always been the practical one about money. I know you'll understand. Love, Dad. I read it twice, my surgical training keeping my hands steady, even as 23 years of carefully buried emotions threatened to surface. Bob had just decided to spend my $180,000 inheritance on my sister's wedding, operating under the assumption that his adopted daughter was still the struggling young doctor who needed family financial guidance. The irony was beautiful in its completeness. While Bob was crafting this message about my supposed need for practicality, I was worth approximately $5 million, and the medical scheduling software company I had built was 3 months away from an IPO that would make me worth closer to $15 million. But Bob had no idea, because somewhere along the way, I had learned that being loved conditionally was safer than risking the disappointment of not living up to the gratitude they expected from their rescued Asian daughter. The irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. Bob had just decided to spend my inheritance on my sister's wedding, operating under the assumption that I was still the struggling young doctor who needed family financial support. What made this particularly interesting was that Bob had completely forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, that I had been financially independent since I was 22 years old. While Bob was crafting his message about my supposed need for practicality, I was worth approximately $8.5 million. The money came from Mediflow AI, the medical scheduling and patient management software company I had founded during my final year at Stanford. What started as a solution to the chaotic scheduling system at the campus health center had evolved into enterprise software now used in over 400 hospitals nationwide. 3 years ago, we had landed our first major contract with Kaiser Permanente. Last month, we had begun the preliminary steps for an IPO that could value the company at $50 million. Bob knew I had done some programming work in college. He assumed it had been a side hustle to help pay for textbooks. He had no idea that Mediflow AI generated more revenue in a single quarter than he had earned in his entire career as a police captain. I typed back a simple response. I want Sophia to be happy too. Whatever makes her wedding day special. The reply came within minutes. Thank you for being so understanding, honey. I knew you'd see the bigger picture. This wedding is going to be featured in San Diego Bride magazine. Sophia is over the moon about it. I slipped my phone back into my scrubs pocket and walked toward the elevator, my mind already working through the implications. The bigger picture Bob mentioned was more complex than he realized. It included the fact that I had been paying my own medical school loans, living expenses, and building a tech empire while my family assumed I was scraping by on a resident's salary. They knew I lived modestly in a small apartment near Balboa Park. They knew I worked long hours at the hospital. What they did not know was that the modest apartment was a choice, not a necessity, and that my work schedule was demanding because I was running 2 careers simultaneously. The elevator arrived and I stepped inside with Dr. Amanda Torres, the chief of staff who had become something of a mentor to me over the years. "Long day, Maya," she said, noting the expression on my face. "Just family stuff," I replied. "Nothing I cannot handle." Amanda nodded knowingly. "Family can be complicated when you are in medicine. They do not always understand the demands of the profession." If only she knew, I thought. The real complication was not that my family did not understand my career. It was that they had no idea I had two of them. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, I found myself thinking about Grandma Pat. She had been the one person who saw potential in me when everyone else saw obligation. When the Chens took me in, they provided a home and stability, and I was grateful for that. But Bob had always made it clear in subtle ways that I was not quite the same as his biological children. Kevin, his son, was this golden child destined for military greatness. Sophia, his daughter, was the princess who deserved the world. And me, I was the adopted project who should be thankful for the opportunity. Grandma Pat had been different. She had looked at me during one of her visits when I was 12 and said, "That girl has fire in her belly. She is going to do something special someday." When she left me that inheritance, it came with a note that I still kept in my desk drawer at home. For Maya, who never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. Bob was about to spend that money on a wedding that would put my adoptive parents $40,000 deeper in debt through a home equity loan. At 63 and 59 respectively, they should have been maximizing their retirement savings, not taking on new debt for a single day's celebration. The irony was that while Bob was mortgaging his future to prove he could provide for his daughters, his adopted daughter had already built the kind of wealth that could take care of the entire family for generations. But they had no idea because I had never found the right way to tell them. How do you explain to the people who raised you that you had surpassed their financial situation so completely that their biggest crisis was barely a rounding error in your monthly revenue reports? As I drove home through the early evening traffic on Interstate 5, I made a decision. This situation was going to resolve itself, but not in the way Bob expected. If my father thought he could spend my inheritance because he still saw me as the grateful adopted daughter who needed guidance about money, he was about to learn just how much he had underestimated the woman I had become. The plan that began forming in my mind was elegant in its simplicity. Bob wanted to provide for his family and prove his worth to Sophia's future in-laws. I was going to let him do exactly that, just not with the money he thought he was using. Sunday dinner at the Chen House in La Jolla had always been a command, performance rather than an invitation. I pulled into the familiar driveway of the Spanish-style home that Bob had bought during his peak earning years as a police captain, back when property values in this neighborhood were still within reach of public servants. Now houses on this street sold for over $2 million, making Bob and Linda accidental millionaires on paper while they lived paycheck to paycheck in reality. Linda answered the door with her usual nervous energy, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel that had seen better days. "Maya, honey, come in. Your father is in the living room with Kevin and his family. Sophia should be here any minute with all her wedding planning materials." The living room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a family gathering. Kevin sat on the leather couch that Bob had bought 15 years ago and refused to replace, his wife Sarah bouncing their 2-year-old on her knee while their 4-year-old played with toy soldiers on the coffee table. Kevin looked tired in the way that military families often did when deployments and financial stress accumulated over years. "There's my successful daughter," Bob announced as I entered the room, standing to give me his standard bear hug. "How are things at the hospital?" "Still saving lives and working those crazy hours. Someone has to keep the heart surgeons busy," I replied, settling into the armchair that had unofficially become mine over the years. I noted the stack of papers on the side table next to Bob's recliner, partially hidden under a Sports Illustrated magazine, but clearly visible to anyone paying attention. Kevin looked up from his son's toy arrangement. "Maya, I heard Dad mention you might be able to give me some advice about consolidating some loans. Military finance is not exactly taught at West Point." "Of course," I said, catching the slight tension in Sarah's expression. "Financial planning can be tricky with irregular deployment schedules." Before Kevin could respond, Sophia burst through the front door like a force of nature, arms loaded with binders, fabric samples, and what appeared to be half the inventory of a wedding planning store. She had inherited Bob's dramatic flair and Linda's attention to detail, a combination that made every event in her life feel like a Broadway production. "Family meeting time," she announced, dumping everything onto the dining room table. "Wait until you see what Tyler and I have planned. The Pendry San Diego is absolutely magical for receptions. The ocean view from the rooftop terrace is like something from a movie. Linda immediately shifted, abandoning her kitchen duties to examine fabric swatches while making appropriately enthusiastic noises. Bob positioned himself at the head of the table like he was conducting a briefing, clearly in his element when it came to logistics and planning. "Tell them about the budget, sweetheart," Bob said, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered in his precise handwriting. "Your old man has been doing some serious number crunching." Sophia's excitement was infectious as she walked us through her vision. The ceremony at Sunset Cliffs, followed by cocktail hour at the Hotel del Coronado, then the reception at the Pendry. 300 guests, live band, professional photographer who has worked with influencers I follow on Instagram. The total came to $220,000, a figure she announced with the confidence of someone who had never paid a mortgage or worried about retirement savings. "Doctors don't make that much starting out," Bob said, glancing in my direction. "But family comes first, and Maya understands that some things are worth the investment. Our girls deserve the best, especially when Tyler's family will be evaluating everything we do." The comment stung in its casual dismissal, but I kept my expression neutral. Tyler's family had money, old San Diego money that came from real estate investments made generations ago when the city was still growing. Bob had mentioned them before, always with a mixture of respect and insecurity that made me uncomfortable. "They're lovely people," Sophia said quickly, sensing the tension. "But Tyler's grandmother can be a little, particularly about traditions and expectations. She keeps mentioning how important it is that everything reflects well on the family name." Linda's nervous energy spiked visibly. "We want everything to be perfect, honey. This is your special day." I watched Bob spread out his financial calculations, noting the confidence in his voice as he explained how he planned to provide for his daughter's dreams. "The inheritance from your grandma Pat will cover about $180,000 of the costs. Linda and I are taking out a home equity loan for the remaining $40,000. The payments will be manageable, and it's worth it to give Sophia the wedding she deserves." "What about your retirement plans?" I asked, genuinely concerned despite my growing irritation with Bob's assumptions about my financial situation. "We'll figure it out," Bob replied with a wave of his hand. "Family comes first. Besides, Kevin here is set for life with his military pension, and you're building a solid career in medicine. We're not worried about the future." Kevin shifted uncomfortably at the mention of his financial security, and I caught Sarah's quick glance downward. There was a story there, one that did not match Bob's confident assessment of his son's situation. The conversation continued around the table, with Sophia detailing every aspect of her planned celebration while Bob played the role of generous provider and Linda offered supportive commentary. I participated when appropriate, but my attention kept drifting to those financial documents partially hidden on the side table. When Bob excused himself to check on something in the garage, I casually picked up the Sports Illustrated magazine, pretending to flip through it while actually scanning the papers underneath. What I saw made my blood run cold. The documents were not just wedding planning materials. They were loan applications, credit card statements, and what appeared to be early withdrawal paperwork from Bob's police pension fund. The numbers told a story that Bob had not shared with the family. He had already borrowed $25,000 against his retirement savings 6 months ago, presumably to cover other expenses that had gotten out of hand. The man who was lecturing me about being practical with money was mortgaging his entire financial future for a single day's celebration, and he had not even told Linda about the extent of their debt. I replaced the magazine carefully, my mind racing through the implications. Bob was not just using my inheritance irresponsibly. He was systematically destroying his retirement security while maintaining the facade of being a provider who had everything under control. The worst part was Kevin's obvious discomfort every time Bob mentioned financial security. My brother was clearly struggling with something, but Bob was so focused on impressing Tyler's wealthy family that he could not see the problems in his own household. As Bob returned from the garage and the family conversation resumed around Sophia's wedding plans, I made a mental note to have a private conversation with Kevin. If my instincts were correct, Bob's golden child was hiding financial problems of his own, and my adoptive father's perception of his family's stability was even more disconnected from reality than I had initially thought. The evening continued with more wedding planning and family updates, but I found myself observing dynamics I had never noticed before. Bob's need to project success, Linda's nervous energy whenever money was mentioned, Kevin's careful avoidance of financial topics, and Sophia's innocent excitement about a celebration that was pushing her parents toward financial ruin. Kevin's phone call came at 11:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, 2 days after our family dinner. I was reviewing patient charts in my home office when his name appeared on my screen. And something about the late timing told me this was not a casual check-in. Between siblings, Maya, I hope I'm not calling too late. I know you keep crazy hours with the hospital schedule. It's fine, Kevin. What's going on? The pause that followed was loaded with the kind of hesitation that comes before admitting something you have been hiding for months. I need some advice about debt consolidation. Sarah and I are drowning in medical bills, and I don't know who else to ask. This was exactly what I had suspected during Sunday dinner. The golden child. Bob's pride and joy was struggling financially while our father planned to mortgage his retirement for Sophia's wedding. What kind of medical bills are we talking about? I asked, switching into the careful tone I used with patients' families when delivering difficult news. Sarah had a miscarriage last year. Insurance covered the basics, but there were complications that required additional procedures. We're looking at about $18,000 in remaining balances. Plus, we've got childcare costs for the kids that are eating up most of my base pay. Army captain's salary sounds impressive until you factor in San Diego housing, costs, and everything else. I could hear the shame in his voice, the embarrassment of having to admit that his military career was not providing the financial security that Bob constantly bragged about to anyone who would listen. Kevin, why haven't you talked to Dad about this? He's always saying how proud he is of your military service and financial stability. Another pause, longer this time. That's exactly why I can't tell him. Dad has spent my entire life building me up as the success story, the son who followed in his footsteps with service and duty. If he finds out I can't even manage my own family's finances, it'll destroy his whole narrative about what he's accomplished as a father. The irony was painful. Kevin was protecting Bob's ego about being a good provider while Bob was simultaneously destroying his retirement savings to fund Sophia's wedding. Both men were trapped in roles that were slowly suffocating them financially and emotionally. Have you looked into military financial assistance programs? I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to walk through the obvious options. First, I've tried everything available through the Army. The problem is that Sarah's medical situation doesn't qualify for most of the emergency assistance programs, and our base pay puts us just over the threshold for other types of help. We're in that awful middle ground where we make too much for assistance but not enough to actually manage everything. Kevin went on to explain the full scope of their situation. 2 kids in daycare, while Sarah worked part-time as a substitute teacher. Rent on a modest apartment in Chula Vista that still consumed 40% of his take-home pay. Car payments on a reliable but aging Honda that they needed for Sarah's work. Commute. The kind of financial pressure that millions of American families faced every day but which Bob somehow remained oblivious to. What's your timeline for resolving this? I asked, my mind already working through possibilities. We need to consolidate these debts within the next 2 months, or some of the medical bills are going to collections. That would hurt my security clearance, which could impact my entire career trajectory in the Army. I understood the stakes now. Kevin was not just dealing with family financial stress. His professional future depended on maintaining his credit rating and security clearance, both of which would be jeopardized if the medical debt situation spiraled further out of control. Let me do some research on debt consolidation options and get back to you, I said. In the meantime, don't do anything that might hurt your credit rating further. Maya, I appreciate this more than you know, and please don't mention this to Dad. He's got enough stress with Sophia's wedding planning, and I don't want him to feel like he failed as a father. After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at my computer screen, processing the full scope of my family's financial dysfunction. Bob was borrowing against his retirement to fund a wedding he could not afford, believing his son was financially secure and his adopted daughter needed her inheritance to stay afloat. Meanwhile, Kevin was drowning in medical debt while protecting Bob's feelings, and I was sitting on enough wealth to solve everyone's problems without making a dent in my overall The next morning I called Marcus Kim, the attorney who handled my intellectual property and business affairs. Marcus had been my lawyer since Mediflow AI's first major licensing deal, and I trusted his discretion completely. Marcus, I need to set up an anonymous grant program, something that can provide emergency financial assistance to military families dealing with medical debt. What kind of funding are we talking about, Maya? Let's start with $50,000 in the fund. I want it structured so recipients receive assistance without knowing the source of the funding. Marcus walked me through the legal requirements for establishing such a program. It would take about 2 weeks to set up properly, with appropriate documentation to ensure the grants appeared legitimate to recipients and any financial institutions involved. While the paperwork was being processed, I researched Kevin and Sarah's specific situation in detail. The medical bills were legitimate. The debt consolidation need was urgent, and their financial stress was affecting their marriage and Kevin's job performance. Sarah had mentioned to Linda during a previous family gathering that Kevin was having trouble sleeping and had become irritable with the children. Classic signs of financial stress impacting family relationships. 2 weeks later, Marcus called to confirm that the Military Family Medical Emergency Fund was officially established and operational. The first recipient would be Captain Kevin Chen and his family, who would receive a grant of $25,000 to address outstanding medical debt and provide a small buffer for future expenses. The notification letter arrived at Kevin's apartment on a Thursday afternoon. According to Sarah's excited phone call to Linda, which Linda immediately shared with me, the grant came from a foundation that provided assistance to military families facing medical emergencies. The letter indicated that Kevin's family had been recommended by a colleague who was aware of their situation and wanted to help anonymously. Kevin called me that evening, his voice a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "Maya, you're not going to believe this. Some military support foundation just awarded us a grant that covers all of Sarah's medical bills plus gives us a cushion for the kids' expenses. I don't even know how they found out about our situation." "That's incredible, Kevin. What did the letters say about how they selected your family?" "Something about a recommendation from a healthcare professional who was familiar with our circumstances and wanted to help without taking credit." "It's like a miracle, honestly." Sarah actually cried when she opened the letter. I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and guilt as Kevin described his family's relief. The solution was elegant and anonymous, exactly what I had intended. But the deception felt heavier than I had anticipated. I was manipulating my family's financial situation from the shadows, playing God with their lives while maintaining the facade of being their struggling younger sister. Still, watching Kevin's transformation over the following weeks confirmed that I had made the right choice. His sleep improved, his relationship with Sarah stabilized, and he was able to be present emotionally for his children in ways that financial stress had been preventing. Bob remained completely unaware of Kevin's previous struggles, continuing to cite his son's military success as evidence of his effectiveness as a father. The irony was that Bob's golden child had needed rescue from the adopted daughter he still saw as financially dependent. But the beautiful complexity of the situation was that no one's pride had been damaged in the process. As I watched my family's dynamics improve, I realized that this anonymous assistance model might be the perfect solution for the larger crisis brewing around Sophia's wedding. Sophia's apartment in Mission Valley reflected her Instagram aesthetic perfectly, all white furniture and carefully curated decorative elements that photographed well under ring lights. When I arrived on Saturday afternoon, she was surrounded by wedding planning chaos that looked overwhelming even by her standards. Fabric samples covered every surface. Vendor contracts were stacked in precarious piles, and her laptop displayed at least 15 browser tabs related to wedding logistics. "Maya, thank God you're here. I'm drowning in decisions and Mom keeps calling with suggestions that contradict everything Tyler and I actually want." I settled onto her white sectional sofa, careful to avoid the scattered wedding materials. Sophia looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. There was a tension around her eyes that I had not noticed during our family dinner, the kind of stress that comes from trying to manage competing expectations while losing sight of your own desires. "Tell me what you and Tyler actually want for your wedding day," I said. "Not what Dad wants, not what Tyler's family expects, just what would make you two happy." Sophia's laugh had a bitter edge to it. "You know what we originally planned? A small ceremony on the beach in Carmel, maybe 50 people total, followed by dinner at a local restaurant Tyler found that overlooks the ocean. The whole thing would have cost about $30,000, including our honeymoon in Europe." "That sounds beautiful and very much like you and Tyler." What changed Dad happened. The minute Tyler's parents visited for the first time, Dad went into overdrive trying to prove we're worthy of their son. He started researching their family background, found out about their country club memberships and charity galas, and decided our wedding needed to measure up to their social standards. Sophia walked over to her laptop and pulled up her Instagram account. The comments section under her recent wedding posts told a disturbing story. Mixed in with the congratulations and heart emojis were pointed remarks about expense and pretension, questions about whether her family could actually afford such an elaborate celebration, and thinly veiled criticism from followers who seemed to resent her sudden upgrade in lifestyle. "It gets worse," she continued, scrolling through her direct messages. "Tyler's grandmother sent me this last week." The message from Margaret Brooks was written in the carefully polite language that wealthy people used to deliver insults. Sophia dear, I do hope you understand the expectations that come with joining our family. The Brooks name has been built on generations of tasteful restraint and community service. I trust your celebration will reflect those values rather than appearing ostentatious. I felt my anger spike on Sophia's behalf. Tyler's grandmother was essentially threatening my sister with social rejection while hiding behind concerns about tastefulness. What does Tyler think about his grandmother's message? I asked. He's caught in the middle. His family has been making comments about Dad's background, calling him a working-class hero in that condescending way that sounds like a compliment but isn't. Tyler loves me and wants to marry me regardless of what his family thinks, but he also doesn't want to create a permanent rift with his grandmother. Sophia collapsed onto the couch next to me, and for the first time since I had arrived, she looked like the vulnerable 27-year-old she actually was rather than the confident influencer she played on social media. Maya, I'm scared that this wedding is going to bankrupt Mom and Dad, and I'm not even sure it's what I want anymore. But Dad is so invested in proving something to Tyler's family that I don't know how to stop this train without breaking his heart. I thought about Bob's hidden debt, the retirement funds he had already borrowed against, and the home equity loan that would mortgage their future. My sister was right to be scared, but she did not know the full extent of the financial damage that was already in motion. What if I told you there might be a way to give Tyler's family exactly what they claim to want while also protecting Mom and Dad's financial future? I said carefully. Sophia looked up with the first hint of hope I had seen in her expression all afternoon. What do you mean? I spent the next hour explaining my research into Tyler's family background. His grandmother, Margaret Brooks, had indeed come from humble beginnings, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had built a textile business in the 1960s through hard work and smart investments. The Brooks family wealth was impressive but relatively recent, earned rather than inherited through generations of old money privilege. More importantly, Margaret Brooks had been involved in charitable foundations throughout her career, particularly those supporting healthcare and education initiatives. Her criticism of ostentatious celebrations was actually consistent with her stated values about community service and tasteful restraint. What if your wedding became a celebration of family values and community service rather than a display of wealth? I suggested. What if the focus shifted from impressing Tyler's family to embodying the principles that his grandmother claims to value? Sophia's marketing background kicked in immediately as she began to see the strategic possibilities. We could structure the celebration around charitable giving, maybe ask guests to donate to a medical foundation instead of giving traditional gifts. We could highlight Dad's police service and your medical career as examples of families committed to public service. Exactly. And if the celebration happened to be funded by a charitable foundation that recognized families demonstrating exceptional commitment to service and education, Tyler's grandmother would have no grounds for criticism. The conversation continued for another hour as we developed a framework that could satisfy everyone's needs while protecting what each person actually valued. Sophia wanted an intimate celebration with meaningful personal touches. Tyler wanted family harmony without compromising his relationship with his bride. Bob wanted to prove his family's worth to people whose respect he craved. Margaret Brooks wanted assurance that her grandson was marrying into a family that shared her stated values about service and community. As I prepared to leave, Sophia grabbed my hand with the desperate grip of someone who had been drowning and suddenly found solid ground. Maya, do you really think this could work? Could we actually pull off a wedding that makes everyone happy without destroying Mom and Dad financially? I looked at my sister, thinking about the foundation I was already planning to establish, the careful research I had done into Tyler's family dynamics, and the $8.5 million in assets that made all of these problems solvable with the right strategic approach. Sophia, I think we can do better than that. I think we can give you the wedding you actually want while solving problems that people don't even know they have yet. The plan forming in my mind was more complex than the simple anonymous grant I had used to help Kevin. This would require careful timing, strategic positioning, and a level of manipulation that made me slightly uncomfortable. But watching Sophia's relief as she began to believe that her happiness did not have to come at the cost of her parents' financial security, I knew the complexity would be worth the outcome. Tyler's family wanted to see evidence of shared values. Bob wanted to prove his worth as a provider. Sophia wanted an authentic celebration without financial guilt. I wanted my family to be happy and secure. For the first time since receiving Bob's text about my inheritance, I began to believe that everyone could get exactly what they needed, even if they never understood how all the pieces had fallen into place so perfectly. Marcus Kim's downtown law office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower that offered sweeping views of San Diego Bay. I had scheduled our meeting for Monday morning, giving myself the weekend to refine the strategy that had been developing since my conversation with Sophia. What I was about to propose was significantly more complex than the simple military family grant that had resolved Kevin's situation. Maya, you mentioned wanting to establish a family foundation over the phone, but I have to admit I'm curious about the scope you're envisioning, Marcus said as he reviewed the preliminary notes I had sent him. I need to create something that appears established and credible, with a focus on recognizing families that demonstrate exceptional commitment to public service education and community values. The Pacific Family Foundation should look like it has been operating quietly for several years, helping deserving families navigate significant life milestones. Marcus raised an eyebrow at the specificity of my requirements. This sounds like it goes beyond typical charitable giving. What's the target demographic for recipients' military families? Law enforcement families, healthcare workers, educators. People who have dedicated their careers to serving others but might not have the financial resources to handle major life events without taking on debt that could compromise their futures. The beauty of this framework was its authenticity. Everything I was describing aligned perfectly with my own family's background and circumstances. Bob's police career, Linda's work in education, Kevin's military service, my medical profession. We were exactly the kind of family that a foundation like this would legitimately want to support. What's the initial funding level? Marcus asked, pulling up the legal documents needed to establish a charitable foundation in California. Let's start with $500,000. I want this to feel substantial enough that recipients don't question the foundation's credibility or ability to deliver on its commitments. Marcus spent the next hour walking me through the legal requirements for establishing a legitimate charitable foundation. The paperwork was extensive but straightforward, requiring articles of incorporation, tax-exempt status applications, and detailed documentation of the foundation's mission and operating procedures. We'll need to establish a board of directors and create a transparent grant application process, Marcus explained. Even though you're the primary funder, the foundation needs to operate independently to maintain its tax-exempt status and credibility. I had anticipated this requirement and already identified potential board members through my professional network. Dr. Amanda Torres from the hospital could serve as medical advisor. A retired military officer I knew through Kevin could handle veteran affairs, and Marcus himself could provide legal oversight. The board would be small but impressive enough to validate the foundation's legitimacy. While Marcus handled the legal framework, I began researching Tyler's family background in greater detail. Margaret Brooks had indeed built her wealth through a textile import business that specialized in ethically sourced materials from developing countries. Her charitable giving focused on healthcare access and educational opportunities for underserved communities. The Brooks Family Trust had funded nursing scholarships, medical equipment for rural hospitals, and literacy programs in low-income neighborhoods. The research revealed something interesting about Tyler himself. He had graduated from UC San Diego with a degree in sustainable business practices and worked for a real estate development company that specialized in affordable housing projects. His career choices suggested someone who shared his grandmother's values about community service, even if his family's wealth created pressure to maintain certain social standards. I found Margaret Brooks's personal story particularly compelling. Her parents had immigrated from Ireland in the 1950s with virtually nothing, working in textile factories before saving enough money to start their own small business. Margaret had expanded that business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise while maintaining her parents' commitment to treating workers fairly and giving back to the community. The parallels to my own story were striking. Like Margaret, I had built wealth through innovation and hard work rather than inheritance. Like her parents, my biological parents had died young, leaving me to be raised by people who provided stability and opportunity even when resources were limited. The difference was that Margaret's adoptive family had recognized and celebrated her achievements, while mine still saw me as the grateful recipient of their charity. By Thursday afternoon, Marcus called to confirm that the Pacific Family Foundation was officially established and ready to begin operations. The foundation's mission statement emphasized supporting families who demonstrated exceptional dedication to public service while maintaining strong educational values and community commitment. The grant criteria were designed to help families navigate major life milestones without compromising their long-term financial stability. I spent Friday evening crafting the foundation's initial outreach strategy. Rather than waiting for applications, the Pacific Family Foundation would proactively identify deserving families through recommendations from community partners. This approach would allow me to target my own family's situation while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate selection process. The first step involved creating a paper trail that would lead back to the Chen family. I arranged for Dr. Amanda Torres to receive information about the foundation through her professional network, with instructions to consider recommending families that met our criteria. Amanda knew my family background and would naturally think of Bob and Linda when reviewing potential recipients. The timeline needed to be carefully managed. Sophia's wedding was scheduled for early October, roughly 12 weeks away. Bob and Linda's home equity loan application was still pending, but they were growing increasingly anxious about the delays. Kevin's situation had stabilized thanks to the military family grant, but he remained unaware of how close he had come to financial disaster. I also needed to consider Tyler's family dynamics. Margaret Brooks would likely investigate any large financial gifts that appeared connected to her grandson's wedding. The foundation needed to be sophisticated enough to withstand scrutiny from someone with her business experience and social connections. Saturday morning brought an unexpected complication when Linda called in, tears. "Maya, honey, I need to talk to someone and I don't know what to do. Your father has been hiding things from me about our financial situation, and I just discovered that he borrowed money from his retirement fund 6 months ago without telling me." This was the conversation I had been dreading since discovering Bob's hidden debt during our family dinner. Linda had finally found the papers that Bob had been keeping in his home office, and the full scope of their financial problems was becoming clear to her. "Mom, how much money are we talking about?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer from my previous snooping. $25,000, plus the inheritance money he wants to use for Sophia's wedding, plus the home equity loan he's trying to get approved. "Maya, we're talking about mortgaging our entire future for one day, and he's been lying to me about how bad things have gotten." The pain in Linda's voice was heartbreaking. She had spent 35 years trusting Bob to handle their family's finances responsibly, and now she was discovering that her husband's pride and desperation were putting their retirement security at risk. This was exactly the opening I needed to introduce the Pacific Family Foundation as a potential solution, but the timing had to be perfect. Linda was emotional and vulnerable, which meant she would be more likely to accept help from strangers. But she was also angry about Bob's deception, which could complicate family dynamics if not handled carefully. As I listened to Linda describe her fears about their financial future, I realized that my foundation strategy needed to accomplish something more complex than simply paying for a wedding. It needed to save Bob's pride while protecting Linda's trust, support Sophia's happiness while satisfying Tyler's family expectations, and ultimately bring my own family closer together rather than driving them apart through secrets and financial stress. The next phase of my plan would require the most delicate timing I had ever attempted. The call from the Pendry San Diego came on a Tuesday morning while I was between surgeries, and the venue coordinator's voice carried the polite but firm tone that hospitality professionals used when delivering ultimatums disguised as customer service. "Dr. Chen, I'm calling about the Harris Brooks wedding scheduled for October 15th. We still need the final payment of $47,000 by this Friday to maintain the booking. I understand there have been some delays with financing, but we do have other clients interested in that date." I thanked her for the call and immediately texted Sophia to get an update on the family's financial situation. Her response came back within minutes and contained a level of panic that made my chest tighten with concern. "Dad had a panic attack last night. Mom found out about the retirement money he borrowed and she's furious. The bank delayed our home equity loan again because of market conditions. We might have to cancel everything." I called Linda immediately, reaching her during her lunch break at the elementary school where she worked as principal. The exhaustion in her voice was evident before she even said hello. "Maya, I don't know what we're going to do. Your father has been lying to me for months about our finances, and now we're facing the possibility of losing Sophia's venue deposit on top of everything else. I've never seen him this stressed, and I'm scared about what this is doing to his health." The situation was deteriorating faster than I had anticipated. Bob's masculine pride was crumbling under the weight of financial reality. Linda's trust in her husband was shattered, and Sophia was caught in the middle of a family crisis that threatened to destroy her wedding plans entirely. That evening, Kevin called with his own update on the family emergency. "Dad asked me for another loan yesterday, but Maya, I can't help him. Sarah and I are just getting back on our feet after that medical debt situation, and I don't want to risk our financial stability again." The irony was painful. Kevin had no idea that his own medical debt had been resolved through my intervention, and now he was being asked to sacrifice his family's financial security to help Bob save face with a wedding that was beyond their means. I could hear the guilt in Kevin's voice as he continued. I feel terrible saying no to Dad, especially when he's been so proud of my military career and financial responsibility. But I have to think about my own kids' future, and this wedding spending has gotten completely out of control. Friday afternoon brought the crisis to its breaking point when Sophia called, me sobbing from her apartment. The Pendry had called to confirm that without payment by close of business, they would release the October date to another client. Bob had spent the morning calling every financial institution in San Diego, trying to secure emergency funding. But his credit rating had been damaged by the retirement fund withdrawal and other recent financial decisions. Maya, Tyler's mother, called me today and suggested that maybe we should postpone the wedding until we get our finances sorted out. She was trying to be helpful, but it felt like she was saying we're not good enough for their family. Dad overheard part of the conversation, and now he's talking about cashing out his entire retirement fund to prove that we can afford this celebration. The situation had reached exactly the point I had been waiting for. My family was desperate enough to accept help from strangers, but they were also at risk of making financial decisions that could destroy their long-term security. Bob's pride was driving him toward choices that would mortgage his entire future, while Linda's anger and fear were preventing her from thinking clearly about alternatives. I made the decision to accelerate my foundation timeline. Saturday morning, I called Linda with what I framed as a coincidental discovery that might help their situation. Mom, I was talking to one of my colleagues at the hospital yesterday about financial stress, and she mentioned something called the Pacific Family Foundation. Apparently, they provide emergency grants to families in public service who are facing major life milestone expenses. Linda's response was immediate and desperate. Maya, at this point I'm willing to look into anything that might help us avoid complete financial disaster. What kind of foundation is this? I explained that the Pacific Family Foundation focused on supporting families who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to public service education and community values. The foundation believed that people who dedicated their careers to serving others should not have to choose between financial security and celebrating important family milestones. The eligibility criteria aligned perfectly with our family's background. Bob's 25 years in law enforcement, Linda's career in education, Kevin's military service, my medical profession. We represented exactly the kind of family that such a foundation would want to support. How do we apply? Linda asked, and I could hear her grabbing a pen and paper to take notes. I've already made some preliminary inquiries through my hospital connections. The foundation doesn't typically advertise their services because they prefer to identify deserving families through professional referrals rather than having people seek them out for money. Over the weekend, I worked with Marcus to expedite the foundation's first major grant approval. The paperwork needed to appear authentic and thorough, with appropriate documentation that would satisfy any questions from recipients or financial institutions that might be involved in the process. By Monday morning, everything was in place for the Pacific Family Foundation to contact the Chen family directly. The foundation's initial letter would offer to cover the remaining wedding expenses plus provide additional family stability funding that could address Bob's hidden debt problems. The grant amount I had approved was precisely calculated, $180,000 to replace my inheritance money that Bob had planned to use, plus $40,000 to cover the home equity loan they could no longer secure, plus an additional $25,000 in family emergency funds that would allow Bob to restore the retirement money he had borrowed without Linda's knowledge. As I finalized the details with Marcus, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and guilt about the elaborate deception I was orchestrating. My family was about to receive exactly the help they needed to resolve their financial crisis and celebrate Sophia's wedding without compromising their future security. But they would never know that their salvation had come from the adopted daughter they still saw as their struggling younger child. The foundation letter would arrive on Tuesday, giving my family just enough time to process the miraculous timing while still meeting the venue's payment deadline. Everything was falling into place exactly as I had planned, but the weight of manipulating my family's emotions and finances was heavier than I had anticipated. Tuesday morning, as I prepared for what would be the most elaborate performance of my life, I realized that I was not just rescuing my family from financial disaster. I was orchestrating a complex test of their values, their relationships, and their ability to accept help from others without losing their sense of dignity and self-worth. The next few days would determine whether my strategy would bring my family closer together or create new layers of secrets and complications that could damage our relationships permanently. The Pacific Family Foundation letter arrived in Linda's mailbox on Tuesday morning at exactly 10:15 a.m., delivered by priority mail in an envelope with the foundation's professionally designed letterhead. I knew the precise timing because I had been monitoring the delivery from my office at the hospital, where I was supposedly reviewing patient charts but actually managing the most complex emotional manipulation of my life. Linda called me within an hour of receiving the letter, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. "Maya, you're not going to— That foundation you mentioned sent us a formal grant application approval letter. They want to award our family $245 to support Sophia's wedding and help with our financial stability." I maintained careful surprise in my voice while Linda read portions of the letter aloud. The Pacific Family Foundation had identified the Chen family through professional referrals that highlighted their exceptional dedication to public service and community values. Bob's 25 years in law enforcement, Linda's leadership in elementary education, Kevin's military service, and my medical career had created what the foundation called an exemplary record of family commitment to serving others. "Mom, that's incredible. What do they need from you in terms of documentation or verification?" "They want tax returns for the past 3 years, verification of Dad's police service, documentation of the wedding expenses, and letters of recommendation from community members who can speak to our family's character and service record." The requirements were extensive but achievable, designed to make the grant feel legitimate while ensuring that my family would qualify easily. Bob's police captain status, Linda's principal position, and Kevin's military rank provided exactly the kind of professional credentials that would impress any foundation review committee. The letter also included a subtle but important detail that addressed one of my biggest concerns about family dynamics. The foundation specifically noted that grant recipients were selected based on their demonstrated values rather than their financial need, emphasizing that families like the Chens represented the kind of character and dedication that the foundation wanted to support regardless of their current economic circumstances. Linda's relief was palpable as she continued reading. "They're not treating us like charity cases, Maya. The letter talks about recognizing families who have earned support through their service to others. It feels dignified rather than embarrassing." "When does the foundation need your application materials?" I asked, knowing that the timeline needed to align perfectly with Sophia's venue payment deadline. "They want everything submitted by Thursday, and they say they can have funding available by Monday if we meet their criteria." "Maya, this could literally save our family from financial disaster." That evening, Bob called me directly for the first time since sending his original text about my inheritance. His voice carried a mixture of pride and bewilderment that made my chest tighten with guilt about the deception I was orchestrating. "Maya, your mother tells me you might have had something to do with this foundation, finding our family. I don't know how to thank you for whatever you did to bring this opportunity to our attention. I just mentioned our situation to a colleague who works with charitable organizations, Dad. The foundation makes their own decisions about who to support." Bob's emotional response surprised me with its vulnerability. "You know, I've been feeling like I failed as a provider for this family, especially with Sophia's wedding costs getting so out of control. This foundation letter makes me feel like maybe we did something right in raising our children and serving our community." The conversation continued for 20 minutes as Bob described his fears about disappointing Sophia and Linda, his shame about the financial decisions that had created their current crisis, and his gratitude for what appeared to be miraculous timing from a foundation that recognized the value of families like ours. Wednesday brought a flurry of activity as my family gathered the required documentation for their grant application. Linda worked with the school district to obtain official verification of her educational leadership record. Bob contacted the San Diego Police Department for service documentation. Kevin provided military service records through his Army Personnel Office. I contributed letters of recommendation through my professional network, carefully coordinated to appear authentic, while ensuring positive reviews of the Chen family's character and community contributions. Dr. Amanda Torres wrote a compelling letter about my medical career and its reflection of family values that emphasized education and service. A retired police officer I knew through Bob provided documentation of his leadership and integrity during his law enforcement career. Thursday afternoon, Linda hand-delivered the complete application package to the Foundation's downtown San Diego office, which was actually Marcus Kim's law firm operating under the Pacific Family Foundation letterhead for the purposes of this transaction. Friday morning brought the call that would change everything for my family. Marcus, using his foundation administrator persona, contacted Linda with news that the Chen family application had been approved for the full $245,000 grant amount. The funding would be available through wire transfer on Monday morning, with $180,000 designated for wedding expenses, $40,000 for family financial stability, and $25,000 in emergency reserves that could be used for future family needs or returned to savings accounts. Linda's call to me that afternoon was filled with tears of relief and gratitude that made maintaining my facade of surprise increasingly difficult. Maya, they approved everything. We can pay for Sophia's wedding without borrowing against the house or using any more of Dad's retirement money. The foundation representative said our family represents exactly the kind of values they want to support in our community. The weekend that followed was a transformation to watch. Bob's stress-related health symptoms disappeared as the financial pressure lifted. Linda's anger about the hidden retirement fund borrowing dissolved into forgiveness as she realized they could restore that money without compromising their future security. Sophia's wedding planning shifted from desperate cost-cutting to joyful anticipation of a celebration that would not bankrupt her parents. Kevin called me Sunday evening with his own reaction to the family's good fortune. Maya, I feel terrible that I couldn't help Dad when he asked for a loan last week, but this foundation grant worked out better than anything I could have provided. It's like someone was watching out for our family when we needed it most. As I listened to Kevin's relief and gratitude, I realized that my anonymous intervention strategy had accomplished something more complex than simply solving financial problems. By providing help that appeared to come from strangers who recognized the family's worth rather than from a family member who had surplus resources, I had allowed everyone to maintain their dignity while receiving exactly the support they needed. But the weight of the deception was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. My family's happiness was built on an elaborate lie that I had created, and their gratitude was directed toward strangers who did not exist rather than toward the daughter who had actually saved them from financial disaster. The next phase of my plan would require maintaining this facade through Sophia's wedding while managing my own growing guilt about manipulating the people I loved most in the world. The transformation in Sophia's wedding planning was remarkable to witness. Over the following 3 weeks, with the financial pressure removed, she abandoned the ostentatious celebration that had been designed to impress Tyler's family and returned to the intimate vision she had originally shared with me. The ceremony would take place at Sunset Cliffs with 50 close friends and family members, followed by a reception at a boutique restaurant in La Jolla that specialized in farm-to-table cuisine. The remaining foundation money allowed for meaningful touches that reflected Sophia's authentic personality rather than Bob's anxiety about social status. She hired a photographer who specialized in candid family portraits rather than the celebrity wedding photographer she had originally booked. The flowers came from a local sustainable farm instead of an expensive florist who imported exotic arrangements. The music would be provided by a string quartet from UC San Diego's music program rather than the elaborate band that had been part of the original extravagant plan. Tyler's reaction to the scaled-down celebration surprised everyone, especially Bob. When Sophia explained the changes during a family dinner 2 weeks before the wedding, Tyler's relief was obvious and immediate. "Honestly, this sounds so much more like us," he said, reaching for Sophia's hand across the table. "The original plan felt like we were putting on a show for everyone else, instead of celebrating what actually matters to us." Bob's response revealed how much the financial stress had been affecting his judgment. "You know, son, I got so caught up in trying to prove something that I forgot what weddings are actually supposed to be about. Your grandmother Margaret is going to love this approach." The mention of Tyler's grandmother had been weighing on everyone's minds, but Tyler's next comment eased those concerns significantly. "I talked to Grandma Margaret about the foundation grant, and she was incredibly impressed. She said that families who attract the attention of charitable organizations dedicated to recognizing service and character are exactly the kind of people she hopes I'll surround myself with." I felt a complex surge of satisfaction and guilt as Tyler continued, describing his grandmother's reaction. Margaret Brooks had spent her own career supporting foundations that recognized working families who contributed to their communities. The Pacific Family Foundation's mission statement aligned perfectly with her stated values, making the Chen family's selection appear not just legitimate but admirable. Linda's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic to observe. The anger and fear that had consumed her when she discovered Bob's financial deception melted away as she realized their retirement security was intact. She threw herself into wedding planning with genuine enthusiasm rather than the desperate energy that had characterized her previous involvement. The foundation money also allowed us to address the subtle class anxieties that had been driving much of the family's stress. Instead of trying to compete with Tyler's family's wealth, Sophia's celebration would highlight the values that both families actually shared. The reception menu would feature locally sourced ingredients that supported sustainable farming practices. The wedding favors would be donations to a scholarship fund for children of first responders and military families. Kevin's relief was evident in ways that extended far beyond the immediate wedding situation. With his own financial stress resolved through the military family grant and the knowledge that his parents were no longer facing retirement insecurity, he was able to be present emotionally for family events in ways that had not been possible when everyone was struggling with hidden financial problems. The week before the wedding brought an unexpected complication when Tyler's parents arrived early to help with final preparations. Robert and Margaret Brooks were gracious and welcoming, but their presence created a new layer of anxiety for me as I realized how thoroughly my deception needed to hold up under scrutiny from people with significant business experience. Margaret Brooks was particularly impressive in person, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built substantial wealth through intelligence and hard work rather than inheritance. During a family dinner at Bob and Linda's house, she mentioned her own background in ways that created surprising parallels to my own story. "You know, I adopted myself when I was very young," she said, looking directly at me during the conversation. "My adoptive parents gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise, but I always felt like I needed to prove that their faith in me was justified." The comment felt like a direct challenge, as if Margaret somehow sensed that there was more to my story than appeared on the surface. But her tone was warm and encouraging rather than suspicious, suggesting that she saw my achievements in medicine as evidence of the kind of character she respected. Tyler's father, Robert, proved equally pleasant, expressing genuine admiration for Bob's law enforcement career and Kevin's military service. The Brooks family's acceptance of our family appeared authentic rather than grudging, which made me realize that much of Bob's anxiety about impressing them had been based on his own insecurities rather than any actual evidence of their judgment. The Pacific Family Foundation grant had accomplished something more complex than simply solving our financial problems. By framing the Chen family's worthiness in terms of service and character rather than financial need, the foundation had elevated our status in ways that made Tyler's family see us as equals rather than charity cases. But my growing guilt about the elaborate deception was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Every expression of gratitude from my family members felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. When Sophia hugged me after her final dress fitting and said that she felt like guardian angels were watching over our family, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to collect my composure. The night before the wedding, as I sat in my apartment reviewing the final details of the celebration that I had secretly funded, I realized that I was facing a moral crossroads that would determine the future of my relationships with the people I loved most. My family's happiness was built on a foundation of lies that I had constructed, and their gratitude was directed toward fictional benefactors rather than toward me. The success of my plan had exceeded my expectations in every measurable way. Sophia would have the wedding she actually wanted without bankrupting her parents. Bob and Linda's retirement security was protected. Kevin's family was financially stable. Tyler's family respected and welcomed the Chens as worthy partners for their son. But the cost of this success was the growing weight of deception that threatened to suffocate the joy I should have been feeling about my family's happiness. Tomorrow's wedding would be a celebration of love and family unity built on the most elaborate lie I had ever told, and I was beginning to wonder whether the truth might be necessary to preserve the relationships that mattered most to me. As I prepared for what should have been one of the happiest days of our family's life, I found myself questioning whether my good intentions justified the manipulation I had orchestrated, and whether my family deserved to know that their salvation had come from within rather than from the strangers they were crediting with their good fortune. Sophia's wedding day dawned with the kind of perfect October weather that made San Diego famous. Clear skies and gentle ocean breezes that carried the scent of eucalyptus from the coastal bluffs. The ceremony at Sunset Cliffs was everything she had originally envisioned. Intimate and authentic, with waves crashing against the rocks below as she and Tyler exchanged vows they had written themselves. I stood with the family during the ceremony, watching Bob wipe tears from his eyes as he walked Sophia down the makeshift aisle. and Linda beam with genuine joy rather than the stressed anxiety that had characterized her wedding planning for months. Kevin was Tyler's best man, looking relaxed and confident in ways that financial stress had previously prevented. The transformation in my family's emotional state was remarkable to witness. The reception at Addison Restaurant in Del Mar buzzed with warm conversation and laughter. Tyler's family mingled easily with ours, and Margaret Brooks spent considerable time talking with Linda about educational initiatives they both supported. The class anxiety that had driven so much of Bob's initial wedding planning had evaporated completely, replaced by genuine connections between families who shared similar values, despite different economic backgrounds. During the dinner service, Robert Brooks approached me at the family table with a comment that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. "Maya, I've been meaning to tell you how impressed Margaret and I are with your medical career. Tyler mentioned that you've also done some work in medical technology development. We're always looking for innovative healthcare companies to consider for investment through our family foundation." I felt my stomach drop as the conversation took an unexpected turn toward my business activities. Bob, who had been listening proudly to the compliments about my medical career, seized the opportunity to boast about his accomplished daughter. "Maya is incredibly modest about her computer programming work, Robert. She developed some software during college that's being used in hospitals now. The company is called Mediflow AI, and from what I understand, it's doing quite well." The moment hung in the air like a ticking bomb. Robert Brooks's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention as he processed the name of my company. "Mediflow AI," he repeated slowly. "Maya, are you telling me that you're the founder of Mediflow AI? The weight of that question carried implications that extended far beyond casual wedding conversation. Mediflow AI has been featured in Forbes and healthcare technology magazines over the past year as one of the most promising medical technology startups in California. Our upcoming IPO had been covered in the San Diego Business Journal. Anyone involved in healthcare investment would recognize the company name and understand its valuation. "I am," I replied simply, knowing that the moment of truth I had been dreading was finally arriving. Margaret Brooks joined the conversation at exactly the wrong moment, having overheard Robert's question from across the table. "Maya, dear, are you saying that you own Mediflow AI, the medical scheduling company that's revolutionizing hospital operations across the country?" Bob's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information. Confusion, then realization, then something approaching shock as he began to understand the implications of what he was hearing. "Sweetheart," he said slowly, turning to face me directly, "how much money does this software company generate?" The entire family table had gone quiet now, with Linda, Kevin, Sarah, and even Sophia and Tyler listening intently to a conversation that was rapidly revealing information that would change everything they thought they knew about me. "Enough to live comfortably," I replied, using the same evasive language I had been employing for years to deflect questions about my financial situation. But Margaret Brooks was not going to let the matter rest with vague answers. She had spent decades in business and recognized evasion when she heard it. "Maya, forgive me for being direct, but Mediflow AI was valued at over $8 million in recent venture capital assessments. If you're the founder and primary owner, you're not just living comfortably. You're independently wealthy." The silence that followed was deafening. Bob stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and what appeared to be the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about his adopted daughter's financial situation was completely wrong. Linda broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maya, honey, are you telling us that you've been wealthy this entire time while we were struggling with wedding costs and borrowing against Dad's retirement?" Moment I had been dreading for months was finally here, and there was no way to avoid the truth any longer. My family was staring at me with expressions that ranged from confusion to something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "I founded Mediflow AI during my final year at Stanford," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional chaos I was feeling. "The company has been generating substantial revenue for the past 3 years. I've been financially independent since I was 22 years old." Bob's reaction was immediate and explosive. "You let us struggle while you were sitting on millions. You watched me borrow against my retirement fund and take out loans against our house while you could have solved all our problems with pocket change." The accusation hung in the air, and I could feel the entire wedding reception beginning to notice the tension at our family table. Tyler's relatives were watching with polite concern, while our own family members struggled to process information that Recontextualized years of relationships and assumptions. Dad, I said carefully, you forgot that the adopted daughter you never quite believed in had built her own empire while you were planning to spend my dead grandmother's money on a... The words came out with more edge than I had intended, revealing years of accumulated resentment about being underestimated and overlooked. Bob's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as the full scope of his misjudgment became clear. Kevin leaned forward across the table, his military training helping him maintain composure while processing shocking information. Maya, are you saying that you've had the resources to help all of us this entire time? When I was dealing with Sarah's medical bills, when Mom and Dad were facing a financial crisis, the moment had arrived for the truth that would either bring my family closer together or relationships I had been trying to protect through months of elaborate deception. I wanted to help the people I love without anyone feeling indebted to me. Personally, I said, looking around the table at faces that reflected confusion, hurt, and dawning understanding. I wanted you to feel proud of your own accomplishments rather than grateful for my charity. Sophia spoke for the first time since the conversation began, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and concern. Maya, what exactly are you telling us about the foundation grant? About everything that's happened? The question opened the door to the complete confession that would determine the future of our family relationships. As I looked around the table at the people I loved most in the world, I realized that the truth was finally going to set us all free from the elaborate web of deception I had created, regardless of the consequences for our family dynamics. The truth spilled out of me like water through a broken dam, and there was no stopping it once it began. I told them everything. About the Pacific Family Foundation that I had created and funded. About the military family grant that had mysteriously appeared to solve Kevin's medical debt crisis. About the strategic timing of foundation interventions that had saved our family from financial disaster while allowing everyone to maintain their dignity. Sophia was the first to fully grasp the implications, her influencer instincts helping her piece together the elaborate social media campaign I had essentially run on my own family. Maya, are you telling me that you paid for my entire wedding, that the foundation money came from you, every penny? I confirmed. The wedding, Kevin's medical bills, the money to restore Dad's retirement fund. All of it came from Mediflow AI revenue. Kevin's military bearing cracked as he processed this information. Maya, when I called you desperate about Sarah's medical debt, you already knew you were going to solve it. You listened to me pour my heart out about feeling like a failure while you were planning to rescue us anonymously. I wanted you to feel proud of your military service rather than ashamed about the financial struggles that millions of families face, I replied. I wanted Dad to feel successful as a provider rather than guilty about not being able to afford Sophia's dreams. Bob had been silent during most of this revelation, but now he spoke with a voice that carried decades of accumulated assumptions crashing down around him. Maya, I spent your entire life treating you like the grateful adopted daughter who needed guidance and support. I lectured you about being practical with money while you were building a multi-million-dollar empire. I decided to spend your inheritance because I thought you were struggling financially. The pain in his voice was evident, but I could also hear something else. A dawning respect that had been absent from our relationship for my entire life. Dad, you forgot that the 8-year-old girl you took in after her parents died had grown up to become someone who could take care of the entire family. You spent so much time trying to provide for us that you never noticed I was already providing for myself. Linda reached across the table to take my hand, tears streaming down her face. Honey, I am so proud of what you've accomplished, but I'm also heartbroken that you felt like we should have been celebrating your achievements instead of worrying about your finances. Margaret Brooks, who had been listening to this family revelation with the fascination of someone witnessing a real-life drama unfold, leaned forward with a question that cut to the heart of everything. Maya, why didn't you just give your family money directly? Why create this elaborate foundation structure? Because I needed to know that you loved me for who I am, not what I could provide, I said, looking around the table at my family. I needed to feel like your daughter rather than your benefactor. I needed Bob to see me as his equal rather than his charity project. The conversation that followed lasted until the restaurant staff began cleaning tables around us. We talked about adoption trauma and the need to prove worthiness. We discussed Asian American expectations and model minority pressure. We explored the complex dynamics of wealth and family relationships and the ways that money can both solve problems and create new complications. Bob's apology was the most difficult and necessary part of the entire evening. He acknowledged years of unconscious bias, of expecting less from his adopted daughter than from his biological children, of failing to see my achievements clearly because they didn't fit his preconceptions about what success looked like. Kevin expressed gratitude mixed with embarrassment about accepting help hadn't known was coming from his sister. Sarah cried as she thanked me for enabling their family's financial stability during a medical crisis that could have destroyed their marriage. Sophia's reaction surprised everyone, including herself. Rather than feeling guilty about the expensive wedding, she felt empowered by understanding that her celebration had been funded by her sister's hard work and success rather than by their parents' financial sacrifice. As the evening wound down, Tyler's family expressed genuine admiration for the foundation concept and offered to collaborate on future charitable initiatives. Margaret Brooks was particularly impressed by the strategic approach to helping families maintain dignity while receiving assistance. The revelation changed our family dynamics immediately and permanently. Bob began treating me as an equal partner in family decisions rather than as a daughter who needed guidance. Linda started sharing my business achievements with her friends and colleagues, finally able to express pride in my accomplishments. Kevin and I developed a closer relationship based on mutual respect rather than birth order assumptions. The Pacific Family Foundation became a real organization that continued supporting military families, law enforcement families, and healthcare workers facing major life transitions. Over the following year, we helped dozens of families navigate financial challenges while maintaining their dignity and self-respect. 6 months later, MediFlow AI completed its IPO at a valuation that exceeded $50 million, making my stake worth approximately $15 million. The money was substantial enough to secure my family's financial future for generations while funding charitable initiatives that aligned with our shared values about service and community contribution. The inheritance money that had started this entire situation remained untouched in its original account, eventually funding college educations for Kevin's children and any future grandchildren in our family. Bob never again made financial decisions without consulting the people they would affect, and Linda became the family's unofficial financial oversight coordinator. Looking back on that wedding day revelation, I realized that the best revenge against being underestimated was not proving people wrong through dramatic confrontation, but by building such an extraordinary life that their recognition became inevitable. Sometimes the most powerful response to being overlooked is simply becoming impossible to ignore. My family learned that the adopted daughter they had sheltered and supported had grown up to become their protector and provider. I learned that love and respect could coexist with wealth and success when everyone involved committed to honest communication and mutual appreciation. The foundation continues its work today, helping families who demonstrate commitment to serving others while facing financial challenges that threaten their stability. Every grant we award honors the memory of Grandma Pat, who saw potential in a grieving 8-year-old and left her an inheritance. That became the seed money for changing dozens of lives. Sometimes the best way to prove your worth is not through confrontation or drama, but by quietly building an empire so impressive that even the people who underestimated you have no choice but to recognize your power. What's your story of turning underestimation into unstoppable success? Share it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family wealth and the beautiful complexity of proving everyone wrong by becoming everything they never thought you could be.